what's going on with science flying high on our orbiting laboratory.
Science!
Yeah, science! Yeah, so yesterday I was over at our space station processing facility where all of our scientists are getting ready, the ones that have living samples or different things that they're going to late load into the rocket, right? And so they're loading their samples, they're working an 18-hour day, and of course we hear, they get kind of first secret notice, right? Don't bother to fill the tubes because, things are going to be delayed. And so then for a while we thought, well, it might still happen the 20th, so instead of the 19th. So then they were starting to replan, okay, now we got to redo all these cultures and get everything ready for tomorrow, so we got to work another 18-hour day. I would have to say, although the scientists that are doing the work right here on site, and it's a pretty small proportion, but they're doing really sensitive work and getting all those samples perfectly ready to go. I think they were a lot disappointed that the vehicle wasn't able to go off this week. But I think they were a little relieved that they didn't have to do it for the 20th and then for the 23rd and then for the 26th. So it was kind of a relief for them to hear that they could go home for Christmas, sleep a lot, and then come back and start prepping samples on the 4th and the 5th for the launch on the 6th. So it's pretty tense over there. It's pretty exciting. One room has Sharmila Bhattacharya, and she is getting ready for the first flight of our new fruit fly facility. And you would think, why on earth flies in space? But in fact, the National Institutes of Health, about 15% of the studies they fund, 15 to 18% of the studies they fund use fruit flies, because it's this genome that is really well understood. We know what every single gene does in the fly, so it's a simpler system than, say, looking at mice or something like that. And it can really give you a lot of information about the things that affect the body when you don't have gravity anymore. So some of Sharmila's earlier work looked at some fruit flies that she flew on the NanoRacks system, and they were able to look at the hearts of the flies. So our heart has 4 chambers, very complicated, very strange shape, very sort of fluid dynamically evolved so that it moves blood in efficient ways, and it mostly keeps this, our hungry brain, loaded up with oxygen. But the fruit flies have a very simple system. They just have a little muscular bulge in a tube that runs right up through their thorax. And it goes like this. But it turns out in her previous flight in the NanoRacks system, she found that heart lost muscle, even in those little tiny fruit flies, just very similar to the way that astronauts' hearts lose muscle when they don't have to keep pumping blood up into the head all the time. So it's really amazing that some simple process like that, you take gravity out of the equation and it affects something as small as a fruit fly or as large as a human being in very similar ways. So it's really exciting to have this new fruit fly lab go up into orbit, partly because it has a centrifuge. And so the centrifuge allows you to do a study that's sort of controlled. I say sort of controlled because spinning at an equivalent of 1G at your feet is not being on Earth. So it's a centrifuge control, but it's really kind of its own treatment. But you could also do partial gravity. So you could say, well, how much does the heart decondition if we lived for a month or 6 months on the moon, right? Because if you remember the astronauts on the moon, they're hopping, like they're super strong because there's that 1/6 gravity. Or how much heart muscle would you lose if you were living for 6 months on Mars? And both of those things are things we have zero data on. We only know what happens to your body after about a day and a half on the moon, because that's 2 days is about the most we ever did on the moon, and we know nothing about what would happen to your body on Mars, especially because you're in a heavier spacesuit. And at 3/5 G, and a 300-pound spacesuit, that's a fair amount to haul around. So that's the kind of work that is being prepped in the labs right here on site, not too far from where you're all sitting. Another experiment that is really exciting is an experiment looking at the virulence of salmonella. And this is interesting because we've got scientists disagreeing, and I love that. That's my favorite part, because that's always a sign that you're getting ready to make an advance, when scientists have different opinions about things. The first result that came in a few years back was from Dr. Cheryl Nickerson. And she found when you flew salmonella, that's the bacteria that causes food poisoning that's on chicken and stuff like that, when you flew salmonella to space and brought it home, and gave it to mice, they were much more likely to die than if the salmonella had just been on Earth. So what she identified is that they had become more virulent, and she identified the genes that turned on to cause that effect. And she figured out those genes had to do with the ions in the medium. And so then she changed the ions in the medium and was able to turn that effect on and off. And it was a super exciting result. We were talking about it to members of Congress. President Obama had heard about it and asked one of our astronauts about it. You know, it got a lot of publicity. And then another scientist said, well, I'd like to fly these little worms, which also get salmonella food poisoning, and they're very small, and let's see if it actually works if you do the whole thing in space. And his results came back that he didn't see that pattern that she had seen with her other study. So now they've got two different study designs, and do they agree with each other's interpretations? Absolutely not. They have very different interpretations of their findings. And so this is Dr. Nickerson's chance then to take a worm model up with the experiment that she has designed and see if she can show kind of more comprehensively or more definitively that it also works in worms, that the patterns and the gene expression and everything she observed is the same in space. So I've been looking forward to this study for several years because it's kind of so important in this back and forth. And the reason it's important in the back and forth is, you know, there's no vaccine for salmonella right now. There's no really good treatment other than giving you fluids and letting you live through it or die through it, as some people say when they've had salmonella food poisoning. So if we could use this to get toward a vaccine or some other kind of treatment. Also, Dr. Nickerson has done some work with other vaccines where you might be able to use salmonella that doesn't make you sick as a vector to have a vaccine that you could take internally that would maybe help against a different disease like pneumonia. So there's all kinds of great things that can be done with these results from space, and they're discoveries that we wouldn't have any other way than by having access to this really unique laboratory where gravity's canceled out and fluids act differently. The whole world of physics is different when you take gravity out of it. It's nothing like what we're used to. So that's just a couple of my favorites that are going up. I'll mention one more and then maybe take a few questions, see what we think of or what you're interested in as well. The other one is completely different than what I just told you about, and that is CATS, the cloud spectrum or cloud lidar that's going up. And CATS is really exciting because it's an instrument that has never been in orbit before. So we have a lot of different kinds of remote sensing instruments on the ISS, and mostly they're just sort of taking advantage of the fact that we're there and have a lot of power and data. You know, you could have put those instruments on anything. You could have put it on a free-flying satellite if you had one available. The great thing about the ISS is this big hunk of real estate, and you can put a lot of instruments on there. We actually have the ability to hold over 30 instruments on the ISS. And CATS is one of the earlier instruments going up. It's an instrument that's been tested on aircraft, and what it can do that no other instrument in space today can do is it can look at clouds. It uses a laser and then looks at the light coming back from that laser, and it's able to measure the depth of the clouds and the structure of the clouds. So if you think about how important that measurement could be for understanding global climate change, right? The greenhouse effect is all about how much does our atmosphere hold in heat, and thick clouds hold in heat a lot more than thin clouds. But when we look at it with a normal kind of optical sensor, it's just white. Thin clouds are white, thick clouds are white, and you don't know anything about it. So what CATS is going to do is give us the ability to make these tests, to prove the algorithms, to prove that these measurements work from space, and then scientists can make a decision about whether it makes sense to have one that's orbiting the Earth all the time making measurements of these clouds. One thing that's really neat is, I don't know if you heard about some of the problems in the cloud forests in Costa Rica. But you know, in Costa Rica, there are these mountains where there's a cloud forest, and the moisture comes in and it hits the mountain, and it turns into these thick clouds and it rains. And in some of those areas, the rain has been decreasing, and that's where a lot of the biodiversity is in Costa Rica. So this kind of data could help scientists to understand, are the clouds not forming the way they used to? You know, are they not thick like they used to be? Is it just that they're not dropping their rain? To really kind of understand what kind of meteorological change is driving all those different things. And then that could help in conserving the forest better. To know, is it you know, something to do with clouds? If it's not, is it something to do with the temperature? These models are very complicated. So that's something completely different that is also really exciting and will be going up on this flight. So what are you guys interested in? Do you have questions or?